My name is Ophelia Ravenshadow. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been known for being steady, dependable, the kind of woman people describe as low maintenance, easy to live with, or strong in a quiet way. I've been a wife, a professional, and a friend who listens more than she speaks. I've learned that when you move calmly through the world, people often mistake that calm for an absence of depth or an absence of limits. If you had met me during my marriage, you might have thought I was lucky. A stable life. No public arguments, no scandals, no dramatic exits. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. And that was the point. I wasn't someone people worried about. I wasn't loud enough to alarm anyone. I wasn't demanding enough to be questioned. I blended into the background of my own life so well that even those closest to me assumed everything was fine. This is not a story about betrayal in a single moment. It's not about a shocking discovery or a cinematic confrontation. Our marriage didn't end suddenly. It withered slowly. It thinned out over the years as a color fading from fabric left too long in the sun. What finally collapsed didn't do so with noise, but with silence that had been accumulating for a very long time. The truth is simpler and harder to see. The breakdown happened in small, ignored moments. Moments that were easy to dismiss. Moments that didn't seem worth addressing. Moments where something was taken. Attention, respect, presence, and nothing was given back. No one moment felt big enough to justify action, but together they rewrote the balance of the relationship. I'm telling this story not to punish anyone and not to present myself as a hero. I don't believe in villains carved in black and white. I believe in patterns, in dynamics, in how people slowly teach each other what is acceptable, and how silence can be interpreted as consent when it is really just endurance. What you'll hear here is not revenge, and it's not a plea for sympathy. It's an honest accounting of how emotional erosion works when it's subtle enough to be socially invisible. There are no explosive scenes ahead, no shouting matches, no sudden windfalls or dramatic turns of fate. What unfolds instead is a series of realizations, some quiet, some uncomfortable, that changed how I saw myself and how I understood power inside a relationship. This is a story about what happens when someone stops explaining their pain and starts observing instead. When stillness becomes a decision, not a default. If you're listening because you felt unseen in a relationship, or because you've wondered whether something that isn't that bad might still be slowly costing you something essential, then you'll recognize parts of yourself here. I won't tell you what to think. I'll just tell you what happened, as clearly and calmly as I can. Before we go any further, let me ask you, gently and without pressure, have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized you didn't lose it all at once, but a little at a time? For a long time, I was known as the steady one. That was the word people used most often, steady, as if I were a piece of furniture, reliable, useful, always in the same place when you needed to lean on something solid. In my marriage, that steadiness became my defining feature. Not my thoughts, not my inner life, not my opinions, just my availability. To my husband, I was the person who handled things. Bills were paid on time, appointments were remembered, family birthdays didn't slip through the cracks. When something went wrong, I didn't panic. I adjusted, I recalibrated. I absorbed the inconvenience quietly and kept going. Over time, this became the role I occupied so completely that no one remembered it was a role at all. It just looked like who I was. Friends saw me as low drama, easy to be around. "You're so chill," they'd say, with admiration that felt strangely hollow. What they meant was that I didn't ask much of them. I didn't take up space in conversations unless invited. I didn't interrupt. I didn't insist. I listened. I nodded. I remembered details about their lives and followed up on them weeks later. That kind of attentiveness made people feel good, but it also trained them not to return it. In public settings, I often became invisible in plain sight, not ignored outright, just gently bypassed. Decisions would be made around me rather than with me. Plans were adjusted without checking whether they worked for me. If I raised a concern, it was met with surprise, as if I had briefly broken character. "Oh, I didn't know you'd mind," someone would say. And I would soften, explain, reassure. I learned to smooth over my own edges before anyone else felt discomfort. At work, my reliability was praised, but rarely rewarded. I was the person managers trusted with complicated logistics because I didn't complain, because I didn't need reassurance, because I didn't push back loudly when timelines were unreasonable. I was thanked privately and overlooked publicly. Over time, I noticed how often my name disappeared from conversations about advancement, even as my labor remained central to the outcome. Inside my marriage, this pattern deepened. I became the emotional climate control system. If he was tired, I adjusted. If he was distracted, I waited. If he forgot something important to me, I told myself it wasn't intentional. I learned to preemptively lower my expectations so I wouldn't feel disappointed. I translated my needs into something smaller, more manageable, easier to ignore. What's difficult to explain is that none of this felt abusive. There were no insults, no raised voices, no explicit declarations that my needs didn't matter. Instead, there was a quiet assumption that I would adapt. And because I usually did, the assumption went unchallenged. Invisibility doesn't announce itself. It settles in gradually, like dust. I don't tell you this with self-pity. I participated in this dynamic. I taught people how to treat me by what I tolerated, by what I explained away, by what I handled alone. I believed that being understanding was the same as being strong. I believed that patience would eventually be noticed and reciprocated. I believed that if something truly mattered, it would be obvious without my having to say it out loud. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit into the lives around me. I was useful, I was safe, I was undemanding, and because I didn't cause friction, no one stopped to ask whether I was slowly erasing myself to maintain that harmony. At the time, I didn't have language for this. I just knew that something felt faintly off, like a low-grade ache you learn to live with. I told myself that this was what adulthood looked like: compromise, maturity, endurance. I didn't yet understand that endurance, when it's one-sided, becomes a form of disappearance. I can still point to the moment when something shifted, even though at the time I didn't name it as damage. It wasn't dramatic enough to earn that word. There was no argument, no betrayal, no apology required. That's why it stayed with me, because everyone else forgot it almost immediately, and I didn't. It happened on an ordinary evening. One of those midweek nights where nothing special is supposed to occur. We had plans to have dinner together, just the two of us, at home. I remember because I had left work a little earlier than usual, rearranged a meeting, and stopped by the market to pick up ingredients he liked. Not as a grand gesture, just as a quiet signal that I was present, that I was choosing us in small ways. When I got home, he wasn't there yet. That wasn't unusual. He often ran late. I started cooking anyway, moving at an unhurried pace, letting the routine calm me. By the time he walked in, the food was almost ready. He kissed my cheek absently, dropped his bag by the door, and went straight to the living room. His phone was already in his hand. I told him dinner would be ready in a few minutes. He nodded without looking up. We sat down to eat, and that's when it happened. Halfway through the meal, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, smiled, and then stood up. "I'm just going to take this," he said, already walking away. Not a question, not a pause, just a statement of fact. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The food cooled. The silence stretched. I could hear his voice from the other room, animated, engaged in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in a while. When he finally came back, he didn't apologize. He sat down, picked up his fork, and resumed eating as if nothing had interrupted us. I remember looking at him and thinking, so this is acceptable now. That thought surprised me with its clarity, not anger, not sadness, just a quiet recognition that something had been crossed without discussion. I considered saying something. It would have been easy enough to frame it lightly. "Hey, next time, can you let them know you're at dinner?" Or, "I'd like it if we could keep phones away when we eat together." Reasonable requests, normal boundaries. But as the words formed in my mind, I felt an equally familiar resistance rise to meet them. I didn't want to seem needy. I didn't want to make a big deal out of something small. I didn't want to interrupt the calm of the evening with what might be perceived as criticism. So I swallowed it. I smiled. I asked him about the call instead. He didn't notice the shift. Or if he did, he didn't register it as significant. Later, when I mentioned the call in passing, casually, almost joking, he laughed. "It was nothing," he said. "You know how work is." And that was that. The moment was closed, filed away as insignificant, except it wasn't anything to me. Not because of the call itself, but because of what it revealed. That my presence could be paused without acknowledgement. That our shared time was interruptible, but only in one direction. That I was expected to accommodate without being consulted. What stayed with me was how easy it had been for everyone else, including him, to move on. There were no ripples, no tension, no sense that anything needed repair. The world continued exactly as before, which meant that if I felt something had been lost, it must have been mine alone. That's how the first small cut works. It doesn't bleed, it doesn't draw attention, it doesn't demand immediate care. It simply marks a boundary that has shifted inward, unnoticed by anyone except the person who now has a little less ground to stand on. I didn't confront him. I didn't journal about it that night. I didn't even label it as hurt. I just remembered it, filed it away quietly, and without realizing it, I began to pay closer attention, not to catch him doing something wrong, but to understand how easily my presence could be set aside. At the time, I told myself it was maturity, that this was what compromise looked like. Those relationships were built on flexibility, not rigid expectations. I didn't yet see that flexibility, when it always bends in the same direction, eventually becomes a fracture. After that first moment, nothing changed on the surface. That's the part that makes these stories difficult to tell. There was no downward spiral you could chart on a calendar. No single incident that would make a friend lean back in their chair and say, "That's not okay." Life continued in its familiar rhythm, and because of that, it became easy to convince myself that what I had noticed didn't require action. The interruptions continued, but they were small. A phone is checked during conversations, plans adjusted without discussion, decisions made while I was technically present but functionally absent. Each time I felt the same brief tightening in my chest, a recognition followed by a calculation. Is this worth addressing? And each time I answered myself the same way, not this one. It's not that serious. I became very good at rationalizing. He's stressed. He didn't mean it that way. I'm more flexible than most people. I don't want to be difficult. These explanations felt generous, mature even. They allowed me to maintain the image of the relationship as fundamentally healthy, with only minor, understandable flaws. They also allowed the pattern to continue uninterrupted. What I didn't realize was how much energy it took to keep explaining things away. Every small dismissal required a quiet internal adjustment, a lowering of expectations, a softening of needs before they could harden into requests. I told myself I was choosing peace, but the peace was fragile, dependent on my constant self-editing. Friends reinforced this without meaning to. When I hinted at feeling overlooked, the response was usually well-intentioned minimization. He's a good guy. No relationship is perfect. You're strong, you can handle it. Their words confirmed what I was already telling myself, that endurance was a virtue and discomfort was something to manage privately. Even I began to forget what I had once expected from a partnership. I stopped anticipating certain gestures because it hurt less not to hope for them. I stopped initiating conversations about emotional needs because they rarely went anywhere productive, not because he was cruel or dismissive in obvious ways, but because he didn't see urgency where I felt erosion. The most dangerous part of this phase was how normal it all became. I adapted so smoothly that there was no friction to signal a problem. When something bothered me, I addressed it internally instead of externally. I reframed. I justified. I moved on. And because I moved on so efficiently, there was never a consequence to prompt reflection on his part. I remember one evening when he canceled plans we had made weeks in advance because something came up. He told me casually, already half engaged in the alternative. I nodded, said it was fine, and meant it in the moment. But later, lying awake in bed, I realized I had been saying it's fine for a very long time, without checking whether it actually was. That realization didn't lead to confrontation. It led to accommodation. I began scheduling my own life in ways that required less negotiation. I filled my time with work, with routines, with solitary activities that didn't depend on his availability. On the surface, this looked like independence. In reality, it was a way to reduce the frequency of disappointment. Disrespect, when it's subtle, doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like background noise, easy to ignore, easy to normalize, especially when you've built an identity around being reasonable, understanding, and low drama. I didn't want to become someone who kept score. I didn't want to monitor behavior or demand change. I believed that if I just stayed patient, the imbalance would correct itself. Instead, the imbalance deepened, because every time I absorbed a dismissal without comment, I reinforced the idea that my presence was optional, not unimportant, just flexible. adjustable, secondary. Looking back, I can see how carefully I protected everyone else's comfort, how I prioritized the smooth functioning of the relationship over the integrity of my own experience. At the time, it felt like love. It felt like commitment. It felt like being an adult who understood that life was complicated and people were imperfect. What I didn't yet understand was that respect doesn't erode in dramatic collapses. It erodes through repetition, through patterns that go unchallenged because they're inconvenient to name, through silence that slowly teaches others how little they need to consider you. By the time I noticed how tired I was, not physically, but emotionally, the behavior that caused that fatigue had already been normalized. Not just by him, but by me. And once something becomes normal, it takes much longer to recognize it as harmful. There came a point when I stopped asking myself why certain things kept happening and started noticing how I was being positioned in the story of our lives. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but consistently. I had been assigned a role, and I had been performing it so well that no one questioned whether it was fair. I was the reliable one, the emotional stabilizer, the person who could be counted on not to complicate things. When plans changed, I adapted. When emotions ran high, I stayed even. When something needed to be handled quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention, it came to me. Over time, this became less a compliment and more an expectation. In conversations, my input was often treated as optional, not dismissed outright, just deferred. Decisions would be made with the assumption that I would be okay with them. If I weren't, that became an inconvenience to manage rather than information to consider. "I didn't think you'd mind," he'd say, genuinely surprised. And I would find myself reassuring him, smoothing over the discomfort of my own reaction. The role required a kind of emotional labor that went unnamed. I tracked moods, I anticipated needs, I adjusted my timing, my tone, my requests to fit the emotional weather of the household. None of this was asked of me directly. That's what made it feel voluntary. But the absence of a request didn't mean the absence of a consequence. What struck me most was how invisible this labor was. When things ran smoothly, it was taken as the natural state of affairs. When they didn't, the disruption was noticeable, and implicitly mine to resolve. I became the buffer between discomfort and daily life, absorbing the impact so others didn't have to feel it. Outside the marriage, this pattern repeated itself. Family gatherings, social plans, and even professional collaborations mirrored the same dynamic. I was the one who followed up, who remembered, who adjusted, the one who could be relied on not to make things awkward. It was as if my defining trait had become adaptability, and everything else, my preferences, my limits, my inner world, had been quietly deprioritized. I began to notice how often I was described in ways that emphasized function over presence. "She's so understanding. She's easy to work with. She doesn't make a fuss." These were meant as praise, but they carried an unspoken implication that my value lay in how little I demanded. There was a moment of clarity one afternoon when I overheard my husband describing me to someone else. He spoke warmly, even affectionately, but what he highlighted was my usefulness and my calm, not my curiosity, not my insight, not the parts of me that felt most alive. I realized then that the version of me he carried was incomplete, and that I had helped construct it by consistently editing myself down. This wasn't something I could confront directly, because it wasn't one behavior that could be corrected with a conversation. It was a dynamic, a pattern reinforced over time by mutual habit, and challenging it would require disrupting the very equilibrium that made life feel manageable. For a while, I told myself that roles were inevitable in long relationships, that someone had to be the steady one, that this was simply how balance worked. But the longer I sat with that thought, the more it rang hollow. Balance implies reciprocity. What I was experiencing felt more like load-bearing silence. I started to understand that being seen as reliable often means being seen as inexhaustible. That's when you don't express strain. Others assume there is none. And that once you've been assigned the role of the one who handles things, stepping out of that role feels like a violation rather than a correction. I didn't yet know what I would do with this understanding. I only knew that something had shifted internally. I could see the role now, clearly outlined. And once you see the shape of the box you've been placed in, it becomes very difficult to keep pretending it isn't there. The day something shifted wasn't marked by an argument or a revelation. There was no moment where I stood up and declared that things would be different from now on. In fact, nothing changed outwardly at all. That's why it took me so long to understand its significance. The shift happened entirely inside me, in a space so quiet that it almost went unnoticed. It was a Saturday morning, unremarkable in every way. We had no plans. The house was still, the kind of stillness that usually feels restful. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking over my calendar for the coming week. It was full of meetings, deadlines, and obligations, mostly things I was responsible for keeping on track. He came in, glanced at the table, and asked what I was doing. I told him I was organizing the week. He nodded, poured himself coffee, and started talking about his own schedule. As he spoke, he casually mentioned a commitment he had made that affected both of us. A dinner I had been looking forward to was no longer happening. He had already agreed to something else. It was said without malice, without hesitation, without awareness that it might require a conversation. And in that moment, something inside me settled, not with resignation, but with clarity. I didn't argue. I didn't point out the pattern. I didn't explain why it mattered to me. I simply listened, nodded, and let the information land. And as it did, I noticed a strange absence. The familiar impulse to adjust, to accommodate, to smooth things over, it wasn't there. Instead, there was a calm observation. This is how it works. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix the feeling. I wasn't reaching for understanding or justification. I wasn't translating my disappointment into something more palatable. I was just seeing the dynamic as it was, without commentary. Later that day, I went for a walk alone. Not to cool off, I wasn't angry, but to sit with the quiet shift that had occurred. As I walked, I replayed moments from the past few years. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just methodically. I saw the pattern with a kind of detachment that surprised me. It was like stepping back from a painting and finally recognizing the image it formed. What struck me most was how much effort I had been expending to maintain something that wasn't actively maintained on the other side. How often I had been the one compensating for imbalance, assuming that was what love required. The realization wasn't painful. It was sobering. I remember thinking, I have been very clear about who I am willing to be. And then, just as clearly, I haven't been clear about who I am no longer willing to be. That distinction mattered. It reframed everything. This wasn't about changing him or forcing a different outcome. It was about acknowledging that my silence had been interpreted as agreement, and that continuing in the same way would only reinforce the same result. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. I stopped expecting unspoken understanding. I stopped assuming that patience would be recognized as an investment. I stopped confusing endurance with strength. None of this required a conversation yet. It required something more foundational, internal alignment. From that day on, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a way to avoid friction. Now, it was deliberate. I began to listen differently, to notice not just what was said, but what was assumed, to pay attention to how often my needs were treated as adjustable variables. I didn't withdraw. I didn't become cold or distant. On the surface, I was the same, calm, reasonable, engaged. But underneath, I was no longer negotiating my worth in real time. I was observing, gathering information, and allowing the pattern to reveal itself fully. That morning didn't end my marriage. It didn't even signal the beginning of the end in any obvious way. But it did mark the moment when I stopped trying to earn consideration and started recognizing when it was absent. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. After that morning, my silence stopped being automatic. It became intentional. That distinction changed everything, even though no one around me noticed it at first. To them, I was the same calm presence I had always been. To me, I was no longer disappearing out of habit. I was choosing when and when not to speak. What surprised me was how quickly that choice altered my internal landscape. I no longer rushed to fill gaps in conversation. I no longer preemptively softened my reactions to protect someone else from discomfort. When something didn't sit right, I didn't immediately translate it into something more acceptable. I let it remain unresolved inside me, not as resentment, but as data. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't a test. It was an observation. I began to notice how often my previous silence had been doing emotional work on behalf of others. When I stopped doing that work, even subtly, small tensions surfaced. Not arguments, just moments of uncertainty. Pauses where someone expected me to smooth things over, and I didn't. Looks of mild confusion when I didn't immediately reassure or adjust. My husband, in particular, seemed unsettled by this shift. Though he couldn't have named why, I was still kind, still engaged, still present, but I no longer anticipated his needs with the same immediacy. I didn't jump in to resolve minor inconveniences. I didn't absorb his stress as if it were my responsibility. I let him experience the natural weight of his own decisions. He mistook this for fatigue at first, then for distraction. At one point, he asked if everything was okay. I said yes, because in a way, it was. I wasn't lying. I was simply no longer offering explanations that would make him comfortable without changing anything. What became clear was how accustomed everyone was to my emotional availability. When that availability became selective, it was noticed, not as absence, but as a disruption of expectation. And yet, no one asked what had changed in me. They only noticed that something they relied on was no longer as readily accessible. Silence, when chosen, has a different quality. It isn't empty, it's attentive. I listened more than ever during this time. I paid attention to patterns, to reactions, to the assumptions people made when they believed I would always adapt. I watched how quickly my lack of immediate response created space that others had to decide how to fill. Most people filled it with their own priorities. That was the point where clarity deepened. I saw without bitterness how little effort was required to maintain the dynamic we had been living in. It persisted not because it was mutually sustaining, but because I had been carrying the invisible load. When I set that load down quietly, the imbalance became visible. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't articulate boundaries yet. I simply stopped compensating. And in doing so, I learned something important. Silence is often mistaken for weakness only by those who benefit from it. There were moments when it would have been easy to revert, to step back into the familiar role and restore equilibrium. The temptation was real, not because I missed the role, but because disruption, even subtle, carries a cost. It introduces uncertainty. It invites questions you may not yet be ready to answer. But I stayed with this discomfort. Not outwardly, life remained calm. But internally, I allowed the unease to sharpen my understanding. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was watching how unseen I had been. This phase wasn't about planning an exit or imagining consequences. It was about reclaiming agency over my own responses. About learning that I didn't owe constant emotional translation to anyone, that I could pause, that I could choose. By the time others began to sense that something was different, the change was already rooted. Silence, once a reflex, had become a position. And from that position, I could finally see the shape of what came next. While everything on the surface appeared unchanged, something precise and methodical was happening underneath. This was the phase no one ever notices in stories like this, because it doesn't look like action. It looks like stillness. But stillness, when intentional, can be deeply productive. I didn't suddenly become secretive. I didn't hide my phone or start behaving suspiciously. I didn't need to. The truth is, no one was watching closely enough to notice the shift from presence to awareness. They were used to my consistency, not my attention. What changed was how I listened. I began to catalog patterns, not emotionally, but structurally. I noticed how decisions were made and who they benefited. I noticed which responsibilities were assumed to be mine by default, and which ones were treated as optional for others. I noticed how often my time was treated as flexible, and how rarely anyone checked before bending it. I started writing things down, not obsessively, not with anger, just facts, dates, conversations. Decisions that affected both of us, but were made unilaterally. Moments when I was informed instead of consulted. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building clarity for myself. There is something grounding about documentation. It removes the haze of self-doubt. When everything lives only in your head, it's easy to question your own perception. When it's written down, cleanly, unemotionally, it becomes harder to dismiss. Patterns stop feeling like isolated incidents and start revealing their shape. At the same time, I began learning, quietly. Not because I planned to leave, but because I realized how little I truly understood about the structures my life rested on. Finances, shared obligations, long-term implications of choices I hadn't actively participated in. I asked questions casually. I listened carefully to the answers. No one was alarmed by this. Curiosity for me was not seen as a threat. It was interpreted as support. What they never noticed was that I had stopped cushioning outcomes. When something didn't work smoothly, I let it be awkward. When plans fell apart, I didn't rush to reassemble them. When responsibilities were dropped, I didn't automatically pick them up. I allowed cause and effect to exist without intervention. This wasn't passive aggression, it was a restraint. The absence of my quiet labor created small gaps, missed details, delays, inconveniences, nothing catastrophic. Just enough to reveal how much I had been holding together without acknowledgement. And still, no one traced those gaps back to me. They were seen as random friction, not the result of my withdrawal. That's the paradox of being invisible for a long time. When you stop doing the unseen work, people notice the discomfort, but not its source. During this period, I became more self-contained. I invested in routines that didn't depend on external validation. Long walks, reading, structured time alone. These weren't escapes, they were recalibrations. I was reconnecting with parts of myself that had gone quiet from disuse. Emotionally, I felt steady, not numb, not angry, just anchored. The urgency I used to feel, to explain, to clarify, to be understood, had dissipated. In its place was a growing sense of sufficiency. I didn't need anyone to agree with my internal conclusions for them to be valid. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was. No one pushed back. No one demanded I return to my old role, because no one had fully recognized that role as labor in the first place. It was just the background hum of life, now slightly quieter. This was when I understood something fundamental. People don't notice preparation when it doesn't disrupt them. They notice only outcomes. By the time anyone would realize that I had changed, the groundwork would already be laid. Not for revenge, not for collapse, but for autonomy. I wasn't planning a dramatic reveal. I was building a position, one rooted in knowledge, not emotion, one that didn't require persuasion or validation, one that would allow me to act cleanly when the time came, without chaos. They never noticed this phase because it didn't demand their attention. And that, in the end, was the point. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where I sat back and thought, this changes everything. It arrived quietly, almost clinically, as most real clarity does. Not as a shock, but as confirmation. By this point, I had gathered enough information to see the full structure of my life, without the emotional overlay I had once relied on to make sense of it. I understood how decisions flowed, where authority actually sat, which assumptions had been made on my behalf, and most importantly, what would happen if I stopped agreeing by default. What I discovered wasn't a secret in the conventional sense. There was no hidden betrayal, no deception that could be exposed with a single conversation. The leverage I uncovered was subtler than that. It lived in asymmetry. I realized how much of our shared life depended on my participation in ways that had never been formally acknowledged. Financial coordination, social continuity, emotional regulation, administrative order. I wasn't just contributing, I was stabilizing. And that stability was quietly propping up choices I hadn't truly consented to. Seeing that clearly was sobering, not empowering in a triumphant way, just clarifying. There's a particular kind of calm that comes when you stop wondering whether you're overreacting. When the question shifts from, am I imagining this? To now that I understand this, what am I willing to continue? That was the calm I felt. I didn't celebrate this realization. I didn't share it with anyone. It wasn't something that needed witnesses. It was private, internal, and irreversible. Once you understand where your real influence lies, you can't unknow it. And you can't pretend it doesn't matter. What struck me was how unnecessary confrontation suddenly felt. I didn't need anyone to admit anything. I didn't need apologies or explanations. The clarity itself was sufficient. It told me exactly how much room I had to move, and how carefully I would need to do so if I wanted to remain aligned with my own values. I revisited my notes during this time, not to add more, but to read them as a whole. The timeline made sense now. The pattern wasn't personal in the way I had once thought. It wasn't about me being unlovable or unworthy of consideration. It was about convenience, about systems that persist because they work, for one side. That understanding stripped away any lingering resentment. Resentment requires a belief that someone owes you recognition. I no longer needed that. I had moved past the need to be seen correctly by someone who benefited from seeing me incompletely. Instead, I felt responsibility, not for fixing the dynamic, but for choosing my response to it with integrity. I didn't want to cause unnecessary harm. I didn't want to scorch the ground on my way out of a role that no longer fit. I wanted my actions to be clean, proportionate, grounded. The private reveal wasn't about gaining power over someone else. It was about reclaiming power over my own participation, about recognizing that I could disengage from certain assumptions without announcing it as rebellion, that I could opt out quietly, precisely, and on my own terms. I began to think less about what should happen and more about what was inevitable if nothing changed. That framing mattered. It removed urgency and replaced it with inevitability. I wasn't rushing toward an outcome. I was simply no longer delaying one. This was also when I made a decision I didn't articulate out loud. Whatever I chose next would be irreversible, not because I wanted finality, but because I didn't want to live in negotiation with myself anymore. I was done with internal bargaining. The clarity didn't make me cold. It made me still. And in that stillness, the path forward became narrow but unmistakable. I haven't moved yet. I didn't need to. Understanding had done its work. Action would come later, and when it did, it wouldn't need justification. The decision point didn't arrive as a sudden crossroads. There was no single night when I lay awake, heart racing, weighing my options in dramatic silence. It came more like a narrowing, a gradual closing of doors I realized I no longer wanted to walk through again. By the time I reached this point, I already knew what could be done. I had mapped out multiple futures in my mind, each one plausible, each one requiring a different version of me. I could speak up, carefully, constructively, and attempt to renegotiate the dynamic. I could ask for counseling, for structured conversations, for a recalibration of roles that had drifted out of balance. I could continue as I was, now armed with awareness, managing my expectations and protecting my inner life, while maintaining the outer form of the marriage. Each option had its logic. Each had its costs. What none of them offered was restoration. That was the realization that settled the matter. I wasn't choosing between happiness and unhappiness. I was choosing between honesty and performance, between living in alignment and continuing to manage an illusion that required my ongoing self-erasure. I examined the idea of speaking up one last time, not with hope, but with realism. I imagined the conversation in detail, the careful phrasing, the reassurance that I wasn't attacking, only explaining. The likelihood of partial understanding, followed by incremental change, would depend, once again, on my vigilance to sustain. I knew how that story went. I had lived versions of it before. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was tired of asymmetry. The option of staying, quietly disengaged, but outwardly present, felt tempting in its familiarity. It would require the least disruption. No one would be hurt. No one would be blindsided. But it would also mean accepting a life where my deepest clarity remained unacted upon, where knowing the truth changed nothing but my internal posture. That felt like a betrayal of a different kind. The irreversible option wasn't dramatic. It was simply this. I would stop structuring my life around preserving a dynamic that no longer reflected who I was. I would choose alignment over accommodation, even if that choice unfolded slowly and without announcement. This wasn't about punishment. I didn't want anyone to suffer. I wanted to be done negotiating my own boundaries internally while presenting calm externally. I wanted congruence. Once I named that, the decision became strangely quiet. Not heavy, not fearful, just firm. I remember noticing how little urgency I felt after that. Decisions made in panic demand speed. Decisions made from clarity allow patience. I wasn't running away from something. I was walking toward coherence. I didn't tell him yet. I didn't owe immediacy to anyone but myself. I continued with daily life, attentive and present, while internally shifting my priorities. I stopped planning long-term futures that required my continued self-suppression. I began imagining a life shaped by my actual needs, not just my capacity to endure. What surprised me most was the absence of guilt. I had expected it to weigh on me, to complicate the decision, but guilt depends on the belief that you are doing something wrong. I wasn't. I was choosing to stop doing something that had quietly cost me too much. The decision point, in hindsight, was less a moment than a settling, a deep internal agreement that I would no longer confuse loyalty with silence, or stability with self-abandonment. From there, everything else became procedural. Once the decision was made, the urgency dissolved. What replaced it was precision. This was the phase where nothing appeared to change, and yet everything important did. I moved through daily life as I always had, calm, reliable, outwardly engaged. But internally, my orientation had shifted. I was no longer maintaining the structure of the marriage. I was preparing to step out of it cleanly. Moving in silence doesn't mean secrecy in the dramatic sense. It means not announcing intentions before they're ready to exist on their own. I didn't want persuasion to enter the equation. I didn't want to be talked out of clarity by appeals to comfort, history, or potential. I wanted my actions to be grounded enough that they didn't require defense. I began with logistics, quietly reviewing documents, understanding timelines, clarifying what was shared and what was individual. I didn't rush. Rushing creates mistakes, and mistakes invite chaos. I wanted this to be measured, almost boring in its execution. I adjusted my finances subtly, not hiding money, not doing anything unethical, just creating visibility where there had been an assumption. Accounts I understood clearly, obligations I tracked independently. I stopped relying on verbal agreements and started confirming things in writing. This wasn't adversarial, it was adult. At the same time, I decentered myself from future planning that required joint consensus. When conversations drifted toward long-term ideas, I listened without investing. I didn't argue, I didn't agree. I allowed ambiguity to exist where I once would have clarified. No one noticed, or if they did, they interpreted it as trust. Emotionally, I stayed even. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly. I didn't create a distance that would signal an alarm. There was no coldness, no punishment. I was simply no longer overextending. I matched energy instead of compensating for its absence. This was when the difference between reaction and intention became clear. Before, I had reacted to maintain stability. Now, I was acting to preserve integrity. The two can look identical from the outside, but they feel very different on the inside. There were moments of temptation to explain, to soften what was coming by hinting at it early, but I resisted. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the process. I wanted the eventual conversation to be grounded in reality, not speculation. I wanted to speak from a place where my footing was solid. Moving in silence also gave me space to grieve privately. Not the loss of the relationship as it was, but the version of it I had once believed in. I let that grief move through me without narrating it to anyone else. It didn't need an audience. What struck me most during this phase was how functional everything still was. The household ran, life continued, and yet the foundation had shifted. I was no longer reinforcing the dynamic that had kept things afloat. I was letting the system reveal its own limits. The absence of immediate consequence confirmed what I had already learned. My labor had been invisible because it had been effective. Removing it didn't cause collapse. It caused delay. The effects would come later, and they would be confusing to those who hadn't seen the preparation. I didn't feel powerful during this time. I felt calm. Power implies dominance over someone else. This was dominance over my own participation. By the time I was ready to speak, everything that needed to be in place already was. There would be no scrambling, no emotional bargaining, just facts, timing, and a decision that had already been lived internally. Silence had carried me this far, not as avoidance, but as alignment. And soon it would no longer be necessary. The consequences didn't arrive with impact. They arrived with confusion. At first, it showed up as an inconvenience. Small disruptions that felt disproportionate to their cause. Things that used to resolve themselves no longer did. Plans slipped. Details were missed. The smoothness people had come to expect from daily life began to falter, just slightly, like a machine that still runs but makes unfamiliar sounds. No one connected these shifts to me. Why would they? I hadn't announced a change. I hadn't withdrawn affection or cooperation in any obvious way. From the outside, I was still present, still reasonable, still engaged. What had changed was invisible. I was no longer absorbing friction on behalf of everyone else. My husband noticed the effects before he noticed the cause. He mentioned feeling overwhelmed more often. Things felt harder, he said, without being able to articulate why. He asked questions that had answers once provided automatically. He paused at decisions that used to move forward without resistance. There was an edge of disorientation in him that I recognized immediately, because I had lived with it for years. What was different now was that I didn't rush to resolve it. I listened, I acknowledged, and then I let the moment stand. I didn't translate his frustration into solutions. I didn't step in to rebalance what had tilted. I allowed the discomfort to exist long enough for it to be felt. That was when the first quiet realization occurred, not in him, but in the space between us. Something was missing, and neither of us named it. The consequences spread outward slowly. Social plans required more effort. Emotional regulation became more visible. The unspoken assumption that things would just work out began to fail in small but noticeable ways. People adapted, but with effort, and effort draws attention. Still, no one asked me directly what had changed. Instead, there were subtle attempts to restore the old dynamic. Increased reliance, requests framed as appreciation, casual reminders of how good we were together. None of it was manipulative. It was instinctive. Systems try to return to equilibrium. What struck me most was how quickly the burden I had been carrying became apparent only after I set it down. Not as gratitude, but as absence. People noticed the loss of ease before they noticed the labor that had created it. My husband became more attentive, not in the way I had once hoped for, but in a searching way. He sensed that something fundamental was off, but he didn't yet understand its shape. He tried to reconnect through familiarity, through shared routines, through gestures that assumed the foundation was still intact. I didn't reject these attempts. I received them calmly, without urgency or expectation. They were no longer currency to me, they were information. This phase was difficult in a quiet way, not because I doubted my decision, but because I could see the confusion it caused. Confusion is uncomfortable to witness, especially when you know you are its source. But I reminded myself of something important. I wasn't causing harm. I was allowing reality to assert itself without interference. The consequences were not punishment. They were the natural result of a system adjusting to the absence of an unacknowledged stabilizer. I also noticed how quickly the narrative began to shift externally. Questions framed around what was wrong rather than what had changed. Subtle concern, mild anxiety, the expectation that something needed fixing, and that I might be the one to fix it. For the first time, I didn't step forward. That restraint clarified everything. It showed me how deeply I had been positioned as the resolver, the emotional custodian. And it confirmed that stepping out of that role was necessary, not vindictive. The consequences continued quietly, gathering weight. And still, nothing had been said out loud. The space between us was filling with something new, not anger, not hostility, but recognition, slowly forming. By the time words would finally be spoken, the reality they described would already be undeniable. By the time the panic surfaced, the structure had already shifted beyond repair. That's the part people misunderstand. They assume awareness comes first, then consequence. In reality, consequence arrives quietly, and awareness comes later, when there's nothing left to stabilize. The first signs were subtle. Questions were asked with a new urgency, attempts to revisit conversations that had never been fully had, a tone that suggested concern, not accusation. My husband began to sense that something essential was slipping, though he couldn't yet articulate what it was or when it had begun. He asked if I was happy. It wasn't the first time the question had come up, but it was the first time it carried weight. Not curiosity, alarm. I answered honestly, but not expansively. I said I was clear. That answer unsettled him more than any complaint would have. Clarity is harder to negotiate with than dissatisfaction. What followed were efforts to restore what he believed we had lost. He suggested more time together, proposed changes, even acknowledged in general terms that maybe he hadn't always been as present as he should have been. These were not empty gestures. They were sincere, and that sincerity mattered. But sincerity alone cannot rewind time. What he was responding to was not the original erosion. It was the absence of my compensating for it. He was reacting to the consequences of imbalance, not to the imbalance itself. And that distinction was everything. I listened to him carefully during this period, not defensively, not with bitterness. I heard the regret in his voice, the confusion, the genuine desire to fix something he had only just realized was broken. And I understood, with a calm certainty, that this was no longer a conversation about improvement. It was a conversation about timing. The changes he was offering now required a version of me that no longer existed. They assumed I was still waiting to be convinced, still hoping for recognition, still negotiating my own boundaries internally. I wasn't. I had already crossed the threshold where effort could feel restorative rather than corrective. That's what makes it too late, not the absence of love or care, but the exhaustion of possibility. I didn't say all of this out loud. I didn't need to. I simply didn't re-engage in the dynamic. I acknowledged his words. I thanked him for his honesty, and I didn't move back into the role that would have made those changes effective. This was the most difficult part, not because I doubted myself, but because I could see his struggle clearly. It's hard to watch someone realize the cost of assumptions they didn't know they were making. Harder still when you know that you once would have done anything to prevent that realization. But preventing it had cost me too much. There is a particular kind of grief that comes when you realize that something could have been saved, just not at the moment it's being addressed. When the window closed quietly, years ago, and no one noticed until the room grew cold. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. Sad but steady. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about accepting that repair requires timely participation from both sides, and that delayed awareness can't substitute for sustained presence. He asked, at one point, what he could do now. It was an honest question, and I answered just as honestly. I told him I wasn't asking for change anymore. I was acknowledging that the relationship had already taught us what it was capable of becoming. That answer didn't land well. It wasn't meant to. The panic intensified briefly after that. Attempts to renegotiate, to reframe, to revisit old memories as proof of resilience. I didn't dismiss those memories. I honored them. But memory is not momentum, and nostalgia cannot replace alignment. By the time the panic gave way to silence, the truth was clear to both of us, even if it hadn't been fully spoken yet. The work required to fix things had arrived after the foundation had already shifted. It wasn't that no one tried. It was that the trying came too late. When the confrontation finally happened, it was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums, no emotional overflow that could be pointed to later as evidence of irrationality. Just two people sitting across from each other, speaking carefully, aware that something irreversible was being named. I chose the timing deliberately, not in a strategic sense, but in a humane one. I waited until I could speak without needing anything from the conversation. No validation, no understanding, no agreement. Only clarity. I told him that I wasn't angry, that this wasn't about punishment or retribution. I explained that the relationship hadn't broken in a single moment, but through a pattern of small omissions that had accumulated over time. I didn't list grievances. I described dynamics. He listened quietly. That surprised me. Perhaps he had already sensed that defending himself would miss the point. When he did speak, it was to say that he hadn't realized how much I had been carrying, that he thought things were fine because I never seemed unhappy. I acknowledged that. I told him it made sense that he believed that. I had been very good at appearing fine. What I didn't do was argue about intent. Intent was no longer relevant. Impact was. I explained that by the time the imbalance became visible to him, it had already reshaped how I related to myself. That the clarity I had reached wasn't something I could reverse, even if circumstances changed. That I no longer wanted to live in a dynamic where my needs had to be discovered rather than respected. The conversation stayed grounded because I kept it grounded. I didn't speculate about the future. I didn't accuse him of malice. I spoke in complete sentences, without qualifiers. I didn't over-explain. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him. There was no emotion he could respond to, no tone he could mirror to shift the balance. Just facts, calmly presented. He asked if there was any way forward. It was a fair question. I told him the truth. I didn't see one that didn't require me to return to a version of myself I had outgrown. That answer wasn't cruel. It was precise. There was a long pause after that. Not tense, just heavy with understanding. I could see him processing, not just the words, but the finality behind them. Finality doesn't need volume. It announces itself through certainty. We discussed logistics briefly, practical matters. The conversation stayed respectful. That mattered to me. I wanted to leave without turning the end into a spectacle, without giving either of us a version of the story that required exaggeration to hold its shape. When it was over, I felt no rush of relief, just a quiet sense of completion. I had said what needed to be said in the way I needed to say it, without heat, without collapse, without surrendering my composure to make the moment feel real. Later, I would realize how rare that kind of confrontation is, how often endings are muddied by emotion that obscures the truth beneath it. This one was clear, clean, painful, yes, but honest. There were no winners in that room. But there was no confusion either, and that mattered. I am not the person I was when this story began. Not because I hardened, and not because I learned how to dominate others. What changed was quieter than that. I learned how to stay with myself. After the marriage ended, there was no dramatic reinvention, no symbolic haircut, no sudden relocation or public declaration of independence. My life didn't fracture, it rebalanced. The absence of constant internal negotiation created a stillness I had never experienced before. For the first time in years, my energy was no longer divided between living and managing how I was perceived while living. I noticed it in small ways. I spoke more directly without rehearsing my words first. How I paused instead of filling the silence. How I no longer softened truths to make them easier for others to accept. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect, for myself and for them. I didn't become louder, I became clearer. The role I had been assigned, reliable, adaptable, emotionally inexhaustible, fell away naturally once I stopped performing it. Some people struggled with that. A few relationships shifted or ended quietly, others deepened. The ones that remained were built on mutual presence rather than assumption. I also learned how to recognize respect not as intensity, but as consistency, as being consulted rather than informed, as having your time and attention treated as finite, not endlessly flexible. These things don't announce themselves dramatically. They show up in patterns, just as erosion does. There is no bitterness in me now. Bitterness requires a belief that something was stolen. I don't feel stolen from. I feel informed. The experience clarified my values in a way comfort never could have. It taught me that endurance is not a substitute for alignment, and that being easy to live with is not the same as being truly seen. I am still calm, still reflective, still capable of patience, but my patience is no longer automatic. It is chosen, and what is chosen can also be withdrawn. That is the quiet dominance people misunderstand. It isn't control over others, it's self-governance. The ability to remain composed while refusing to abandon yourself for the sake of harmony. I don't regret loving deeply, I don't regret trying. What I regret, if regret is the right word, is how long I confused silence with strength. How long I believed that if something mattered enough, it would be noticed without my having to name it. Now I name things early, gently, clearly, and I pay attention to how they're received. That attentiveness is not vigilance, it's discernment. My life is simpler now, not because it is smaller, but because it is less divided. I am no longer living in fragments, one version of myself inside, another outside. What you see is what you get. Calm but not accommodating at my own expense. If there is power in that, it comes from alignment, not opposition. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to extract a lesson that sounds clean and decisive, to say something like always speak up or never settle. But life rarely responds well to slogans. What I've learned is quieter, and it took much longer to understand. The truth is, nothing in this story happened because someone was cruel or because love was absent. It happened because comfort can slowly replace curiosity, and because silence, when it's consistent, teaches people what they no longer need to pay attention to. Most harm isn't intentional, it's accumulative. If there is a moral here, it's not about leaving. It's about noticing earlier, noticing when your understanding is always required, but your experience is rarely explored. Noticing when you're praised for being easy, calm, or strong, but never asked what that strength costs you. Noticing when peace depends entirely on your ability to absorb discomfort quietly. Relationships don't fail only when something bad happens. Sometimes they fail because nothing changes. What ended my marriage wasn't a lack of love. It was a lack of mutual presence over time. A slow erosion that no one meant to cause and no one knew how to stop, because it was never loud enough to demand attention. I don't believe in villains here, I believe in dynamics, and dynamics persist until someone stops participating in them the same way. When that happens, the system reacts, not because it's evil, but because it's losing something it depended on. Quiet dominance isn't about winning in the end. It's about refusing to disappear at the beginning. If you take anything from the story, let it be this. You don't need to justify your clarity. You don't need to wait until you're exhausted to be allowed to change. And you don't need dramatic conflict for your reasons to be valid. Understanding something deeply is enough. There are people listening to this who will recognize themselves, not as me, but as who I used to be. The one who holds things together, the one who doesn't make a fuss, the one everyone relies on, while rarely checking how much you're carrying. If that's you, I hope the story doesn't push you toward anger or impulsive decisions. I hope it gives you permission to observe, to ask yourself, calmly and honestly, what patterns you are sustaining, and whether they still deserve your participation. Endings don't have to be loud to be real, and strength doesn't have to announce itself to exist. Before we close, I want to leave you with one question, not to answer immediately, but to sit with, In your own life, where have you been quiet? Not because you had nothing to say, but because you learned that saying it wouldn't change anything. If you're comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Not for judgment, just for recognition. That's where real conversation begins.